In the winter of 1959, 9 young hikers pitched a tent on a remote Siberian mountainside. They were experienced, they were prepared, they were excited. None of them would see the morning. When rescuers finally found their campsite 3 weeks later, what they discovered made no sense. The tent was still standing, but it had been slashed open from the inside. Inside, all their gear lay perfectly arranged: boots, coats, food. Their last meal, untouched. Outside, 9 sets of footprints led down the mountain into the darkness. They were barefoot, or wearing only socks, in temperatures of 30 below zero. 5 of the bodies were found within a mile of the tent. They had died of hypothermia, but the remaining 4, they were discovered months later, buried under 10 feet of snow in a ravine. One had a skull fractured so severely that investigators compared it to the impact of a car crash. Another had her ribs crushed. Her eyes were missing. Her tongue was gone. 2 of the hikers' clothes tested positive for radiation. The Soviet investigation lasted just a few months before the case was closed. The official cause of death? An unknown compelling force. That single phrase, unknown compelling force, has haunted this case for over 60 years. And in that time, the theories have only multiplied. Avalanches, secret weapons tests, UFOs, the Yeti, KGB assassinations. But after 6 decades, scientists may have finally pieced together what really happened on that frozen mountainside. And the truth is, both simpler and more terrifying than anyone imagined. To understand what happened on Dyatlov Pass, you have to understand who these people were. They were not reckless. They were not careless tourists wandering into danger. These were some of the most capable young mountaineers in the Soviet Union. The group formed at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, a prestigious technical university. They were students and recent graduates, engineers, scientists, people who approached problems with careful planning and discipline. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. By all accounts, Dyatlov was exactly the kind of person you wanted in charge of an expedition: meticulous, calm under pressure, respected by everyone who knew him. He had planned every detail of the journey down to the hour. The other members, Zina Kolmogorova, 22, Rustem Slobodin, 23, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both 21, Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, Alexander Kolevatov, 24, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 23, and the oldest member, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a World War II veteran who had joined the group at the last minute. And finally, there was Yuri Yudin, 21. Yudin was the 10th member of the expedition. He would become the only survivor, not because of anything that happened on the mountain, but because of something that happened before they even reached it. On January 25, 1959, the group boarded a train heading north. They sang songs, they played mandolins, they wrote in their journals, joking with each other, full of energy and anticipation. These journals, and the photographs they took, would later become some of the most important evidence in the case. By January 27th, they had reached the last inhabited settlement before the wilderness, the small village of Vizhai. They stocked up on supplies, left behind anything they wouldn't need, and prepared for the most difficult stretch of their journey, the uninhabited Ural Mountains. It was here that fate first intervened. Yuri Yudin had been suffering from worsening pain in his joints. It was sciatica, aggravated by the cold and the physical strain. The pain became unbearable. He could barely walk. Dyatlov made the call. Yudin needed to turn back. He would only slow the group down. So Yudin said goodbye to his friends. He shook hands with Dyatlov. He promised to see them when they returned. That was the last time anyone saw any of them alive. For the rest of his life, Yuri Yudin carried the weight of that moment. He was the one who got away. He often said he wished he had stayed with them, but his body had made the decision for him. The remaining 9 pressed on, and in their diaries from those days, you can feel their confidence. They described cheerful evenings around the stove, hot meals, friendly arguments about skiing technique. They faced biting winds and plunging temperatures. But nothing in their writing suggests fear. Nothing suggests they sensed what was coming. They documented everything. The photographs from this period show the group smiling, struggling through deep snow, posing against the vast white landscape. These were people who genuinely loved what they were doing. On January 31st, they reached a river valley and began to climb toward the mountain pass. They cached extra supplies in the valley below, planning to collect them on the return trip. The plan was straightforward: push through the pass, reach Mount Otorten, and then circle back. But the next day, February 1, would change everything. February 1, 1959. The weather had been deteriorating. Winds picked up. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. In the swirling snow, the group lost their bearings. Instead of heading toward Mount Otorten, they were pushed off course, toward a different mountain. The local Mansi people called it Kholat Syakhl. The translation is unsettling: Dead Mountain. Now, Dyatlov had a decision to make. They had lost an entire day of progress. Night was falling. The safe move would have been to retreat down into the forest, where the trees would provide shelter from the wind. But Dyatlov was determined not to lose ground. He made the call to pitch the tent directly on the exposed slope of the mountain. They cut into the snowpack to create a flat surface. They secured the tent with skis and poles. To experienced mountaineers, this was not a reckless decision. It was calculated. Camping on the slope meant they could resume their climb immediately at sunrise. No time lost. The group spent the evening preparing a final meal. They wrote their last journal entries, light-hearted notes, plans for the route ahead. They snapped photographs of each other, bundled against the storm, smiling despite the conditions. The last photograph ever taken of the group alive shows them digging out the platform for their tent in deep snow, faces barely visible in the whiteout. They look tired but determined. Their final diary entry reads, "It is difficult to imagine such comfort on the ridge, with shrill howling wind, hundreds of kilometers away from human settlements." And then, nothing. No more journal entries, no more photographs, no more signs of life. Something happened that night. Something that caused 9 experienced hikers to cut their way out of their own tent, their only shelter, their only chance of survival, and flee into the frozen darkness without boots, without coats, without any of the gear that lay perfectly organized just inches away. The footprints they left behind tell a strange story. Deep, evenly spaced tracks. Not the chaotic prints of people running in panic. These were people walking calmly, in single file, down the mountain slope. Some of the tracks were made by bare feet, others by socks. One set of prints showed a single shoe. They walked like this for nearly a mile, through snow, through 30 below zero temperatures, until they reached the shelter of the trees. What could possibly compel 9 trained, rational people to abandon everything and walk calmly toward almost certain death? That question is at the heart of everything that follows. Back home, people began to worry. Dyatlov had promised Yuri Yudin he would send a telegram as soon as the group returned from the expedition. The journey was expected to take about 16 days, maybe a few more if the weather turned bad. But as February wore on, no telegram arrived, no word, nothing. By February 20th, the families of the hikers were pressing for action. The Ural Polytechnical Institute organized a search party. Fellow students and teachers volunteered. When they found nothing, the search expanded. Soldiers, helicopters, and local Mansi hunters joined the effort. On February 26, 25 days after the group was last seen alive, the search party finally located the campsite, high on the slope of Kolatsiakl. They found the tent first. At a glance, it seemed almost normal, half buried under a thin layer of snow, tilted slightly. But as the rescuers got closer, the strangeness became apparent. The canvas had been cut open from the inside, long, deliberate slashes. Snow had blown through the gaps, covering everything. And here's what made it so unsettling. The hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside: knapsacks, boots, heavy coats, blankets, all of it. The food they had prepared sat uneaten, no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing was missing. The only thing missing was the people. Outside the tent, the search party found footprints, at least 8 or 9 distinct sets of tracks. They led down the slope, away from the tent, toward the forest below. The tracks were calm and orderly, not the kind of frantic scrambling you'd expect from people fleeing for their lives. And they were made by people wearing socks, or nothing at all. Investigators followed the trail. At the edge of the forest, beneath a large cedar tree, they found the remains of a campfire, and near that fire, buried in the snow, the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both men were almost completely naked, wearing only their underwear. In 30 below zero temperatures, their hands were raw and bloody, as if they had torn at the tree bark in desperation. Krivonishenko's body showed 3rd-degree burns on his shins and feet, and inside his mouth, investigators found something disturbing: a chunk of flesh. He had bitten off a piece of his own hand. Whether from delirium, from attempting to stay conscious, or from something else entirely, no one could say. Above them, the branches of the cedar tree had been broken off, some of them more than 15 feet off the ground. Scraps of clothing and skin were found embedded in the bark. Why were they climbing the tree? Were they trying to see their way back to the tent, gathering wood for the fire? Or were they trying to escape something on the ground? Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies. Igor Dyatlov himself. He was lying face up in the snow, clutching branches. His fists were clenched. He had been trying to crawl back to the tent when he collapsed. Zina Kolmogorova. She was found about 600 feet from the tent, better dressed than the others, but still not adequately. Bruises on her hands and face. Her fists were clenched too. Rustem Slobodin, also on the path back to the tent. His skull showed a crack, not fatal on its own, but enough to disorient him. He likely fell, got up, fell again, and eventually couldn't get up anymore. All 3 had died of hypothermia. Their bodies showed signs they had been manipulated after death, likely by their surviving companions, adjusting them respectfully, taking what clothing they could use. That was 5 bodies accounted for, but 4 were still missing. The search dragged on for 2 more months. The snow was too deep, the terrain too difficult. Then, in early May, the thaw began, and a local hunter found something in a ravine, a shallow den dug into the hillside, a last-ditch attempt at survival. Inside that den, buried under more than 10 feet of snow, were the final 4 hikers: Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. They were dressed more warmly than the others, wearing clothes they had taken from their dead companions. A rational, desperate act of survival. But their injuries were anything but rational. Thibault-Brignol's skull had been crushed, not cracked, crushed. The force required to do that kind of damage was compared by the medical examiner to a car accident. But here's the thing. There were no external wounds to his head, no cuts, no bruises. The skin was intact. The bone beneath it was shattered. Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs and massive internal hemorrhaging. His chest had been compressed with impossible force. Again, no external marks. Dubinina's injuries were the most disturbing. 10 of her ribs were broken. She had hemorrhaged into her heart. Her tongue was missing. Her eyes were gone. Parts of her face, the lips, the soft tissue, had been removed. Kolevatov's injuries were less catastrophic, but he too showed fractures. He too had been crushed. How do you shatter someone's bones without leaving a mark on their skin? The medical examiner admitted he had no explanation. And then there were the other details, the ones that turned this from a tragedy into something darker. Some of the bodies had an unusual orange-brown discoloration on their skin, a deep tan that their families insisted they did not have when they left. Why would bodies exposed to sub-zero temperatures develop a tan? 2 of the hikers' garments tested positive for radiation, not massive amounts, but enough to be detected and recorded by investigators. And one of the cameras, Zolotaryov's, contained photographs that appeared to show strange lights in the night sky. Blurry streaks of light, too large to be stars, too slow to be meteors. The Soviet investigation was brief. Autopsies were conducted. Evidence was catalogued. Witnesses were interviewed. Local Mansi hunters were questioned, then cleared. They had joined the search effort willingly and expressed nothing but sorrow. And then, in May 1959, just a few months after the bodies were discovered, the case was closed. The official cause of death? A phrase that has become infamous, an unknown compelling force, which the hikers were unable to overcome. That was it. That was the explanation. The case files were classified. The area around Dyatlov Pass was made off limits. Witnesses were told not to discuss what they had seen. And for the families, there were no answers, just silence, and a phrase that seemed designed to raise more questions than it answered. Unknown compelling force. What does that even mean? The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, would say little publicly for decades. But in 1990, after he retired, he published an article. In it, he made a startling claim. The Soviet government had forced him to abandon his real theory. They had removed everything from the official report that mentioned UFOs, glowing orbs, or anything unusual in the sky. Ivanov wrote, "I suspected at the time, and am almost sure now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death." He wasn't alone. Other hikers camping 50 kilometers away that same night reported seeing orange, floating orbs in the sky, in the exact same direction, at the exact same time. So what were these lights? And what did they have to do with 9 young people dying on a frozen mountain? In the 60-plus years since the Dyatlov Pass incident, the theories have only multiplied. And in some ways, that's the most fascinating part of this case. It has become a kind of mirror, reflecting back whatever people are most afraid of. Let me walk you through the main ones. The UFO theory. This is where those glowing orbs come in. Multiple independent witnesses, the Mansi hunters, the hikers on a neighboring mountain, and even the lead investigator himself, all reported seeing strange lights in the sky on the night of the incident. Orange spheres, moving slowly, too large and too slow to be anything conventional. When Zolotaryov's camera was developed, some of the final frames showed blurry streaks of light against the dark sky. Were these just overexposed shots? Lens flares? Or was he photographing something real? Something that terrified them enough to flee their tent? Proponents of this theory argue that the hikers encountered a UFO, tried to document it, and were either killed by it directly, explaining the massive internal injuries with no external marks, or driven into a state of panic that led to their deaths indirectly. It's a compelling theory, partly because it would explain so many of the strange details at once, but it also requires believing in something we have no definitive proof of: the military weapons test theory. This one is, in many ways, more grounded. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were remote, sparsely populated. In other words, perfect for secret military testing. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was testing everything. Some researchers point to parachute mines, explosives dropped from planes that detonate just above the ground. These weapons cause massive internal trauma while leaving surprisingly few external marks, which sounds eerily consistent with the autopsy results. The radiation on the clothing? Two of the hikers, Krivonishenko and Kolevatov, had worked at nuclear research facilities. The radiation traces could have come from contaminated work clothing, but conspiracy theorists argue that's too convenient. They believe the hikers stumbled into a radiation-related weapons test and the government covered it up. The quick closure of the case, the sealed files, the official silence. In the paranoid climate of Cold War Russia, a military cover-up didn't seem far-fetched. But there's another, stranger version of this theory. Some researchers have pointed out that Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest hiker, the one who joined at the last minute, had a background that raised questions. He was a combat veteran. He had worked for the Soviet secret police. Before joining the expedition, he had been employed at a top-secret scientific facility in Moscow. Was Zolotaryov a KGB agent? Was the hiking expedition a cover for something else? Did his presence put the group in danger? We'll probably never know. The infrasound theory. This one is fascinating because it's grounded in actual science. When wind passes over a dome-shaped mountain like Kholat-Syakhl, it can generate something called a Kármán vortex street. This produces ultra-low-frequency sound waves, infrasound. You can't hear it, but your body can feel it. And here's the thing about infrasound. It has been scientifically proven to cause dizziness, nausea, disorientation, and overwhelming feelings of irrational fear and panic. People exposed to infrasound have reported sensing an invisible presence, a feeling that something is terribly wrong, an urge to flee. If a particularly powerful infrasound event hit the Dyatlov campsite that night, it could explain why 9 rational, experienced hikers suddenly cut their way out of their tent and fled into the night for no apparent reason. But infrasound doesn't crush rib cages. It doesn't shatter skulls. So while it might explain the initial flight, it doesn't explain the fatal injuries. The Yeti theory. I'm going to keep this one brief. A Soviet tabloid pushed the idea that the hikers had been killed by the abominable snowman. A Discovery Channel documentary in 2014 tried to revive it, citing a blurry photograph from one of the hikers' cameras that they claimed showed a humanoid figure. The photograph is real, but it's almost certainly just a person in snow gear. No claw marks, no animal tracks, no sign of a struggle. The Yeti theory is tabloid fodder, nothing more. So with all of that, the UFOs, the weapons tests, the infrasound, the Yeti, what actually happened? In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation, and in 2020, they announced their conclusion. The hikers were killed by a slab avalanche. At first glance, it sounds anticlimactic. After all, hadn't the avalanche theory been discussed and dismissed for decades? The local Mansi said the area didn't get avalanches. Rescuers saw no evidence of a slide when they arrived. And if a massive avalanche had hit the campsite, wouldn't it have swept everything away? But here's what makes the slab avalanche theory different from the classic avalanche idea, and why it took until 2019 for scientists to prove it was possible. A slab avalanche is not the massive, roaring wall of snow you see in movies. It's small, it's localized, and it's often almost silent. Here's how it works. A slab avalanche happens when one compact layer of snow suddenly fractures and slides as a single block, like a pane of glass shattering along an invisible fault line. It doesn't require a steep slope, just a slope that's been disturbed. When Dyatlov's group cut into the snowpack to create a flat platform for their tent, They disturbed the natural structure of the snow. Then, overnight, katabatic winds, powerful downdrafts that raced down mountain slopes, piled additional snow on top of the slab above their camp. Over the course of hours, the weight increased, the pressure built up, and eventually the slab gave way. It wouldn't have been a massive wall of snow. It would have been a relatively small block, maybe a few meters wide. Just enough snow to collapse onto the tent, pinning the hikers underneath. Not enough to leave obvious traces that would still be visible 3 weeks later, after wind and fresh snowfall had erased the signs. Under that slab, in the pitch darkness, in sub-zero temperatures, some of the hikers were already injured, their ribs fractured, their skulls struck, by the weight of the snow pressing them against the hard ground beneath them. The rest cut their way out. They had to make a choice: stay and risk another collapse, or retreat to the forest where the trees would offer protection. They chose the forest. They walked calmly, not running, because they were acting rationally. Experienced mountaineers executing an evacuation. Some were already underdressed, some had no shoes, but they believed they could build a fire, wait out the night, and return to the tent at dawn. At the cedar tree, they started a fire, but with the wind and the cold, it wasn't enough. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, the most poorly dressed, were the first to succumb. The others cut clothing from their dead friends and divided it among themselves. 3 of them, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, attempted to return to the tent. They collapsed in the snow before they could reach it. The remaining 4 dug a snow den in the ravine. It was the right survival move, but they chose a spot above a stream that never froze. The flowing water eroded the snow above them. The roof of their den collapsed, burying them under 10 feet of compacted snow. 50 tons of snow, pressing down with the weight of a tank. That's what crushed their ribs. That's what shattered their skulls. That's why there were no external marks. The pressure was uniform, massive, inescapable. The missing tongue and eyes? Almost certainly the work of scavenging animals and months of decomposition in running water. The orange skin discoloration, natural post-mortem changes. The radiation, traces from the lanterns they used and the nuclear facilities where some of them had worked. And the glowing orbs? Soviet missile tests, confirmed to have been taking place in the region that same week. A coincidence, not a cause. Here's the thing that sticks with me about the Dyatlov Pass incident. These 9 people did almost everything right. They were prepared. They were experienced. They were smart. When disaster struck, when the snow collapsed onto their tent, they didn't panic. They evacuated in an orderly line. They built a fire. They constructed a snow shelter. They shared whatever clothing they had. In almost every other situation, those decisions would have saved their lives. But they made one critical mistake: the placement of the tent. They camped on an exposed slope, on a weak snowpack, in a place where a rare but devastating slab avalanche was possible. And that one decision, compounded by brutally bad luck, was enough. Today, Dyatlov Pass is a destination. People from around the world travel there to walk in the footsteps of those 9 hikers. They leave flowers at the cedar tree, where the broken branches are still visible after all these years. They stand at the stream where the final 4 were found and say quiet prayers. Just before the expedition began, Yuri Krivonishenko, the 21-year-old who would die under that cedar tree, his body burned by the fire he had desperately tried to keep alive, wrote a poem for his friends. It ended like this: "Here's wishing you camps, pitched on distant mountains, routes to hike over ranges untamed, packs that rest lightly on your backs, and weather that smiles upon your quest. Let your footprints trace winding tracks across the map of Russia." They left their footprints, all right, not just on the map of Russia, but on the imagination of the entire world. And 67 years later, we're still following them, still trying to understand what happened that night on Dead Mountain. If the story touched you, please subscribe so you don't miss on the next cases. Every subscription helps stories like this continue to be told to those who need to hear them. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next case.